off this list in our number 10 spot, we have John George High. John George High, commonly referred to as the acid bath killer, was an infamous English serial killer who operated in the 1940s. His gruesome crimes shocked the nation and earned him a chilling reputation for his method of disposing of the victims' bodies, which involved dissolving them in sulfuric acid. His victims included both men and women whom he targeted for their money and possessions. High would befriend his victims, gaining their trust before luring them to his place of work, a warehouse located in Crawley, West Sussex. High believed that if there were no physical remains, the police would have no evidence of his crimes. However, his assumption proved to be flawed. What a shocker. Police investigators found that while the acid effectively destroyed most of the victims' bodies, certain remains such as dentures, bone fragments, and other non-organic materials were resistant to the corrosive effects. Eventually, High's crimes caught up with him. In 1949, he was arrested for the killing of a wealthy man named Archibald Henderson, whose disappearance had raised suspicions. During his interrogation, High confessed not only to killing Henderson, but also several other individuals. At his trial, High's sanity became a significant point of contention. He claimed that he was driven by a compulsion to drink human blood and that he believed he could turn his victims' bodies into sludge, allowing him to absorb their wealth. Despite these claims, the court found High guilty and he was sentenced to death. On August 10, 1949, John George High was executed by hanging at Wandsworth Prison in London. In our number 9 spot today, we have Martha Beck and Raymond Fernandez. Martha Beck and Raymond Fernandez, notorious as the Lonely Hearts Killers, were a criminal couple who operated in the late 1940s. Using various aliases and personas, Fernandez would respond to Lonely Hearts ads placed by women seeking love or companionship. He would pose as a charming, attractive man, enticing these women into romantic relationships. Beck, playing the role of Fernandez's sister or relative, would eventually join the relationship, gaining the trust of the victims. Once the couple had gained the woman's trust and manipulated them emotionally, they would proceed to rob them of their money, possessions, and even their personal savings. In some cases, the victims' bank accounts would be emptied and their properties sold off. As their greed and desperation increased, the couple turned to killing in order to eliminate any potential witnesses who could expose their criminal activities. Their crimes eventually caught up with them when they targeted a widow named Janet Fay in 1949. Fay's sister became suspicious of Fernandez's intentions and alerted the authorities. The couple was apprehended in Michigan and extradited to New York for trial. During the trial, Martha Beck and Raymond Fernandez confessed to multiple crimes. Both Beck and Fernandez were found guilty and sentenced to death. On March 8, 1951, Martha Beck was executed in the electric chair at Sing Sing Correctional Facility. Raymond Fernandez met the same fate on the same day. In our number 8 spot today, we have Charles Sabraj. Infamously known as the Bikini Killer or the Serpent, was a serial killer active during the 1970s who targeted and preyed upon Western tourists traveling through South Asia. He would approach them, often posing as a gem dealer or an official guiding them through the region. Once he had gained their trust, he would employ various methods to incapacitate and then take the life of his victims. These methods included poisoning, using intoxicating substances, and sometimes even more violent physical methods. He would then rob them of their belongings, including money, passports, and any valuable possessions. Despite being arrested multiple times, he demonstrated remarkable skills in manipulating the legal systems of various countries. He often managed to escape from custody either through bribery, forging documents, or exploiting legal loopholes. However, his luck eventually ran out. In 1976, while attempting to poison a group of French students in New Delhi, he was arrested by authorities. In 1977, he was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment in India. Over the years, he faced additional legal troubles in countries like Thailand and Nepal, which further extended his time behind bars. In our number 7 spot today, we have Gary Heinous. This is a name you might be more familiar with than some of the others on this list, and that is because this is the man who inspired the character of Buffalo Bill in the infamous novel Silence of the Lambs. If you're familiar with the literature, you'll know that that's absolutely not a good sign. Gary Heinous was an American serial killer who committed heinous crimes in the late 1980s. Heinous kidnapped and tormented 6 women, imprisoning them in his home. He would lure them into his home under false pretenses, offering food, shelter, or something else that they needed or wanted. Once inside, he subjected them to unimaginable horrors, imprisoning them in a pit dug in the basement of his house house, which was later named the Pit of Horrors. Of course, I cannot detail much more of his crimes in order to stay within the guidelines of YouTube, but it's safe to say it was absolutely horrendous. Tragically, 2 of Heinous' victims did not survive the ordeal. The remains of Deborah Dudley and Sandra Lindsay were discovered in Heinous' basement, leading to his arrest in March 1987. The remaining 4 women were rescued and provided critical testimony against him. During his trial, Heinous' disturbing and psychopathic behavior became very apparent. He displayed no remorse for his actions and even attempted to act as his own attorney. His behavior and erratic courtroom antics added to the shock and horror surrounding the case. Ultimately, he was found guilty of multiple counts of killing and many other charges as well. He was sentenced to death and spent several years on death row while his case went through numerous appeals. On July 6, 1999, Gary Heinous was executed by lethal injection at the State Correctional Institute in Rockview, Pennsylvania. In our number 6 spot today, we have Yang Xinhai. Yang, also known as the Monster Killer, was one of the most prolific serial killers in China's history. Active from 1999 to 2003, he terrorized multiple provinces by taking the lives of his victims, often targeting entire families. Yang's heinous crimes shocked the nation and left a lasting impact on Chinese society. In 1988, at the age of 20, Yang embarked on his life of crime. He was arrested and imprisoned for a series of burglaries, spending time in a labor camp. Following his release in 1999, he began a spree of violence that would terrify communities throughout China. Yang's MO involved breaking into houses during the night, often in rural areas where security was relatively lax. He would then kill the occupants, and he showed no mercy or remorse. The brutality and frequency of Yang's crimes were unprecedented in China. He showed a complete disregard for human life, often leaving behind scenes of extreme violence and horror. Despite the high number of killings, Yang managed to evade capture for several years. However, in November 2003, Yang's killing spree came to an end. During a routine police inspection, he was caught in the act of committing a burglary. When questioned by the police, Yang confessed. During his trial, he showed no remorse for his actions and appeared detached from the gravity of his crimes. He was found guilty, and in February 2004, Yang was sentenced to death and executed soon after. In our number 5 spot today, we have Pedro Rodrigues Filho. Also known as the Padrino Matador, he is a Brazilian serial killer who is believed to have killed over 70 people, mostly other criminals, in the 1960s and 1970s. Pedro had a difficult childhood as his father was a notorious criminal who actually really sadly harmed and killed his mother. This of course had a profound influence on Pedro and his life. This experience is believed to have contributed to his violent behavior later on. Pedro began his crime spree at a super young age, and he started with a horrific crime when he killed the vice mayor of his town, who he believed was responsible for the death of his girlfriend. He continued to kill other criminals, often targeting those who had previously wronged him or his family. Pedro was arrested in 1973 and was eventually convicted of killing 71 people. Although he was sentenced to 400 years, there was a maximum time of 30 years, which Pedro served before being released in 2007. Pedro himself passed away earlier this year in March after being killed by 2 still unknown suspects. In our number 4 spot today, we have Karl Panzram. Karl Panzram was a notorious criminal and serial killer who committed a wide range of heinous acts during the early 20th century. In his own written account, Panzram claimed responsibility for 21 killings and thousands of burglaries. Throughout his criminal career, he traveled extensively, committing a slew of violent crimes along the way. This geographical dispersion made it difficult for law enforcement to connect his crimes and build a comprehensive profile of his actions. He targeted individuals who he perceived as easy victims, often taking advantage of their vulnerability or luring them into isolated areas. In 1928, Panzram was apprehended and arrested for burglary. While in prison, he authored an autobiography in which he provided a chilling first-hand account of his crimes and his deeply antisocial mindset. Panzram's writings offered a disturbing glimpse into the mind of a remorseless and violent individual. On September 5, 1930, Panzram was executed by hanging at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in Kansas. His execution marked the end of his violent reign, but his written confessions and personal accounts continue to fascinate and disturb those interested in the psychology of criminal behavior. In our number 3 spot today, we have Stephen Richards. Stephen Richards, also known by his alias Captain Moonlight, is a notorious figure in Australian criminal history. Before adopting his criminal persona, Richards pursued a career as a lay preacher in the Anglican Church. However, his actions were not in line with his religious calling. He engaged in fraudulent activities including embezzlement and insurance scams, which led to his imprisonment in 1869. During his time in prison, Richards met another criminal named Jesse Nesbitt, and together they formed a bond. Upon their release in 1874, Richards and Nesbitt began leading a gang that engaged in robberies and confrontations with law enforcement. Richards adopted the moniker Captain Moonlight as his alias, and his charismatic personality garnered attention from both the public and the media. He cultivated an image of a romanticized outlaw, drawing inspiration from the legends of American Old West figures like Jesse James and Ned Kelly. In 1879, the gang attempted to rob a bank in New South Wales, resulting in a violent shootout. Several members of the gang, including Nesbitt, were killed, and Richards was captured along with the remaining members. Following their capture, Richards and his surviving gang members were put on trial for killing. The prosecution argued that Richards had ordered the shooting of a police officer during the failed bank robbery. Despite his claims of innocence, Richards was convicted and sentenced to death by hanging. In the early morning hours of January 20th, 1880, Stephen Richards met his fate on the gallows at Darlinghurst Gaol in Sydney. In our number 2 spot today, we have Thomas Neil Cream. What a horrible name. So bad. Thomas Cream, dubbed the Lambeth Poisoner, was a Scottish-Canadian doctor who gained notoriety for his terrifying activities during the late 19th century. Cream's preferred method of killing was poisoning, and he targeted his victims, particularly women with whom he had been romantically involved. His crime spree started to crumble after the death of a woman named Matilda Clover, who had been his lover. Suspicion arose regarding her sudden demise, and an investigation was launched, and evidence pointed toward Cream's involvement. However, lacking concrete proof, authorities were unable to bring charges against him. Cream, undeterred, continued his killing spree, but his luck would soon run out. In 1892, Cream's crimes were exposed when he implicated himself in a series of poisonings in a bid to frame others for the killings. His actions drew attention, leading to his arrest and subsequent trial. During the trial, Cream made several erratic outbursts, including accusing others of being the true culprits, but to no avail. In October 1892, Thomas Neil Cream was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. On November 15, 1892, he met his fate at Newgate Prison in London. In our number 1 spot today, we have Andrei Chikatilo. Andrei, infamously known as the Butcher of Rostov, was a Soviet serial killer who terrorized Russia for over a decade. Operating between 1978 and 1990, Chikatilo was responsible for taking the lives of at least 53 people, predominantly young and vulnerable individuals. His MO typically involved approaching his victims under the pretense of offering assistance, promising them employment, or personal favors. Once he gained their trust, he would then lead them to a secluded location where the horrors would take place. In 1990, his crimes were finally brought to an end. A series of coincidences and the persistence of an investigator named Viktor Burakov led to his identification and subsequent arrest. Despite his initial denial of the crimes, DNA evidence eventually linked him to them, leading to his confession. During his trial in 1992, he was found guilty of 53 killings, although he later claimed to have killed more than 100 victims. Chikatilo was sentenced to death and executed on February 14, 1994.
Number 10. David Berkowitz. Also known as the Son of Sam, David Berkowitz is a killer who again thinks that he works for the devil, which is obviously a horrible start. This time, the real culprit for the horrible crimes was a demon who had taken the shape of a dog that belonged to his neighbors. That's who he put all the blame on. So you ever find yourself in some hot water, just blame the neighbor's demon dog. See if that works for you. David led authorities on one of the largest manhunts ever seen in New York, and in true twisted killer fashion, he left notes behind, trying to be arrogant, trying to be cool, thinking he would never get caught. You know, working a 9 to 5 in the underworld, you'd think there'd be more places to duck out and hide, but oddly enough, David was caught, and oddly enough, he was convicted. He later admitted to making up the dog story, which I called off the hop, I knew it. But he did say that he was a member of a violent satanic cult and his crimes were committed as part of that. So I was like, hey, it's good. No, it's actually way worse. Now we're talking about cults. Number 9, Robert Pickton. This horrible person is one of the worst Canadians to ever live and is one of our country's worst serial killers ever. Pickton dropped out of school and began working at his family's pig farm, and this is where most of his absolutely horrific crimes took place. He was first arrested in 2002 and was convicted in 2007, taking the lives of 6 people, but throughout a long investigation, evidence of many more killings ended up coming to light. So it was bad at first with 6, and then it went way up. During his time in jail, an undercover police officer posed posed as a cellmate, and Picton actually confessed to him. He confessed to 49 crimes, so a little higher than 6. Apparently he was saying to said undercover officer that he wanted to take one more life and make it an even 50, and that he only got caught because he was, quotes, sloppy. The entire trial was a bit of a mess, but it led to a life sentence without the possibility of parole for 25 years, which was the longest possible sentence under Canadian law at the time. This unfortunately does mean that he will be eligible for parole within the next decade, so let's hope, nothing happens anymore with this guy. Let's just keep them locked away. You know what, like after 42, you're like, no, people can't change, actually. Number 8, Chester Turner. Chester is an American serial killer who on April 30th, 2007 was convicted of taking the lives of 11 women in the Los Angeles area. And on June 19th, 2014, he was convicted of 4 more that they were able to then tie back to him. He has been referred to by prosecutors as one of the most prolific serial killers in the city's history, and if you know anything about Los Angeles history, that's crazy. In his original trial that led to conviction, Chester was sentenced to death, but at the following trial in 2014, he also received an additional sentence to death. Now we're at 2, that's lovely. In the end, like with a lot of these kinds of stories, in the end, DNA came to save the day and help authorities find out who was committing these horrible crimes. So, yeah, science changing the game. Who done it? Number 7, the Zodiac Killer. This one had to make it on the list because, well, it had to. There's a plethora of terrifying people on this list. Nothing is as terrifying as an uncaught serial killer, and the Zodiac is definitely the most prolific of that category. The Zodiac Killer, they made movies about this guy. The Zodiac Killer took the lives of 5 people in the San Francisco Bay Area between December 1968 and October 1969. He was most known for targeting young couples, sadly, or lone male cab drivers. Despite 2 people luckily and thankfully escaping his attempted evil doings, he has still never been caught. Number 6, Albert Fish. Albert is one of the oldest people on this list. Got a bit of an old head here. He was dubbed the Brooklyn Vampire. He was also dubbed the Moon Maniac. He was also dubbed the Boogeyman, so again, cool nicknames for cool dudes, love it. It's clear that Albert was a terrible human being who did terrible things, that's why he's on this list. In the early 1900s, for example, Albert was arrested, tried, and convicted for killing and then consuming 3 people, but the horror was not over yet. No, as if it could get any worse than that. No, Albert began to claim that although people knew about 3 of these killings, the number was actually closer to 100, give or take, and he even claimed that he had some in every state, which is the most disgusting thing I've ever heard. And to make matters even worse, as if again wasn't already terrible enough, this deranged lunatic also sent a letter to the mother of one of his victims, just detailing everything about how he lured her and the rest of these horrific events that took place afterwards. I can't even talk about it, but that's the worst thing I've ever heard, I think. That's one of the worst things I've ever heard. Number 5, Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey is one of the most well-known serial killers, with his crimes taking place from 1978 to 1991. Have you watched the Netflix movie or the documentary? One of the hundreds of things on murderers now, for some reason. Every killer gets his own Netflix special, apparently. Well, his crimes are far too brutal for this channel, but he's known for taking the lives of 17 different people. Again, if you've seen the documentary, you know what's up here. At his trial, not only did he plead not guilty, but his attorney had some pretty interesting words for the court. His attorney said that he became enamored, overwhelmed, even caught up in a character from the movie Exorcist 3. Which character? Well, he got caught up in the character of Satan, because, he's the personification of evil. Who better, right? Not only was Jeffrey found to be sane and ended up being sentenced to multiple life sentences in prison, spoiler alert, but not too long after his sentence started, he was killed by a fellow inmate. Nice, I wonder if the devil made him do it. Number 4, John Bodkin Adams. He was once a general practitioner in the British community in Essex. Most of his patients were elderly, and he treated said elderly patients with care. For a bit. From 1946 to 1956, John had around 160 patients that died suspiciously, and that out of those 160, 132 of them left valuables for him. Wow, what are the odds? Must have been some really great care he was providing. Must have really touched their hearts. Not fishy at all in any way, shape, or form. Of course, the wills were later to be found fraudulent because, well, as per this list, obviously, you could have guessed. Worst part of all this, John was acquitted. His trial established the doctrine of double effect, which is where a doctor giving treatment with the aim of relieving pain may lawfully, as an unintentional result, shorten their lives. So they're like, sometimes it happens, 132 times. So out of the dozens of cases that ended horribly, Adams was charged for only 2. That's it. He wasn't even convicted of their deaths even. He was guilty of forging prescriptions and falsifying medical forms. Number 3. Hu Wanlin. Hu started his life in jail in the early 1900s, and he was there as a result of human trafficking charges. Right off the bat, he's just, yep, go away, bye-bye now. You would think once inside, prisoners would have a tough time continuing said practice, but not Hu Wanlin. While in jail, he kicked off his own medical practice, and then in 1997, after a retrial, Hu was released from prison. Now, once released, Hu continued this medical practice that he started, again, behind bars, must I remind you. Again, he's not a doctor. Not really, he's not a medical practitioner. He's just a guy who was reading some books in jail. So for the next few years, he treated many people with this herbal remedy that actually contains sodium sulfate, which is very lethal. It is suspected that because of this, he ended up taking the lives of 146 people. Who was arrested again in 1999 and was sentenced to only 15 years in prison for practicing medicine without a license. Yeah, that's the charge you're gonna get. Okay. Shortly after his, again, release in 2014, it's believed that he was responsible for another death, this time of a 22-year-old student. Now, don't get me wrong, I believe people can change, to a certain degree, like Robert Downey Jr. changed, this type of stuff. No, you can't risk having these people in public. It's not fair. 146 lives, we gotta avoid this at all costs. Number 2, Aham Cardle. One of the worst when it comes to Turkey serial killers. His nickname by the media, because apparently, like I said, everyone gets a cool DC villain's nickname. His nickname is the Izmir Monster. He killed a young woman in the mid-80s, but once he was checked into a mental hospital, he was either released or he escaped. It's a little bit blurry, but he did this multiple times. And then once he was out, he would repeat said disgusting crimes and then go back in. It was just a terrible, broken, vicious circle. He would leave, assault somebody, and be sent back. It was the worst. Clearly something was not working. He shouldn't have been released once, nor should he have escaped, obviously. But after an escape in 2000, he was caught, and then something really bizarre happened. You ever hear about the old story where the only two vehicles in the world, there was like only 2 cars, and they somehow ended up crashing? Here we go. He was killed by somebody else on this list. He was killed by this next evil person coming up at number 1. Number 1, Ali Kaya. Yep, it's all about who you know. Imagine running in 2 killers running into each other. This is what happens. Nicknamed the Babyface Killer, Ali Kaya was convicted of 10 killings, but in 2012, the man was released after a report stated that he had a mental disorder. So this obviously leads into some other stuff. His next step at this point is perhaps everybody's worst nightmare. He immediately attacked those who had testified against him during his original trial. He ended up taking the lives of 3 of those people and leaving 2 others injured. He was then recaptured in 2013. Thankfully, nobody else got hurt after his initial release. But remember that horrible guy I just mentioned at number 2, Aham Cardle? Well, when he was finally put back into that mental facility after escaping and killing over and over, this is the guy that ended up taking his life in jail. What do you know? You played yourself. Ali Kaya killed Aham Cardle in jail in 2000. Small world. I guess it's all about who you know, or who you should know, or who you shouldn't know, I guess, in this case. Yeah, ironic, but twisted nonetheless. Number 10. Richard Ramirez. Okay, here we go, right off the hop. Richard, who is also known as the Night Stalker, he was a serial killer who terrorized the streets of LA back in the 80s. He was known for, invading homes, which left him initially being dubbed as the walk-in killer, but he had another signature that was concerning to many people as well, especially during the height of the satanic panic. This is not good. Richard was known for leaving behind different satanic messages at the scene of his crimes. Because of his satanic signature, after he left his first pentagram at the scene of a crime, authorities became worried that he was just a Charles Manson copycat, but instead he was, his own kind of monster. Nice. It is said that he would leave more pentagrams behind while also telling his victims to swear to Satan instead of swearing to God. During his court appearances, he would hold up a pentagram, and after pleading not guilty, he said, "Hail Satan." Yep, it would appear otherwise, my friend. Okay. Number 9. John Dee. John Dee was a scientist from the mid-1500s. Okay, we're going way back for this next one. In Elizabethan fashion, the scientist also fancied the occult, because I guess they were all bored back then. He worked alongside Edward Kelly. Now at the time, John Dee was working in the court of Queen Elizabeth I. To show you what kind of role he played in, a functioning society, John Dee casted an astrological chart in order to determine when the queen should be crowned. Yeah, he was one of those guys. So cut to 1581, both John Dee and Edward Kelly both claimed to communicate to the other side via via crystal balls. Eventually, the town wasn't cool with this guy speaking to angels or demons, because, yeah, surprise, surprise, not everyone's on board with that. What'd you know? So the Queen sent him to Manchester. She's like, get out of here. But when he arrived, he was warden. He was warden of Manchester Collegiate Church. John Dee refused to be part of exorcisms, but a table with an odd demonic bird mark found afterwards. So he's been busy, it seems. This mark is said to be from the hoof of the devil when John Dee summoned him. The British Museum still has John's demonic obsidian mirror if you want to take a peek yourself and see, how those curls are doing. Number 8, Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey is one of the most well-known serial killers, with his crimes taking place from 1978 all the way to 1991. His crimes are far too brutal to really get into, but he's known for taking the lives of 17 different people. Now, at his trial, not only did he plead not guilty, but his attorney had some interesting words for the court. His attorney stated that his bloody pattern had caused him to believe that he was the devil, which was intended to, bolster his insanity plea. His attorney said that he became enamored, overwhelmed, even caught up in the character from the movie The Exorcist 3. Yeah, said character was Satan. Yeah, if you're thinking, oh, which one? Is it the neighbor? No, the devil. Not only was Jeffrey found to be sane and ended up being sentenced to multiple life sentences in prison, of course, but not too long after his sentence started, he was killed by a fellow inmate. Number 7, Louis Garavito. Louis gained a nickname from the media called the Beast, so that's gonna tip you off of where this one's gonna go. Louis is said to be one of the worst serial killers of all time, and it's believed that his victim count is somewhere in the 300s. That is brutal. Now, he's confessed to 147 crimes, and he was found guilty on 139 of them, which puts his sentence at 1,853 years. But here's the thing. His trial took place in Colombia, of course where he lives, and there's a law there which puts the maximum sentence to only 30 years. So yeah, he shaved a couple hundred off of that, I guess. He was sentenced in 1999, so you can do a little bit of quick math there. And according to Louis himself, he committed these crimes because he had made a deal with the devil, and he explained that a satanic ritual was involved in all of his crimes. Number 6, H.H. Holmes. He's considered America's first serial killer, and he was especially gruesome. H.H. went to medical school, and shortly after finishing, he began killing people in order to steal their property. He built himself a huge, horrifying house that he'd built to include things like secret passages, trapdoors, soundproof rooms, doors that lock from the outside with gas jets on the inside. He even had to kill him to cremate the bodies. Not only would he get close to women to take control of their finances and then, ultimately kill them, but he would also require his employees to take out life insurance policies that named him as the beneficiary. It isn't exactly known how many victims he had, but it's thought to be somewhere over 200. He was sentenced to death when he was finally caught, and it's said before his execution, he famously said, "I was born with the very devil inside me." Number 5, Sam Little. Known for being one of the worst serial killers in history, Sam Little has confessed to taking the lives of more than 90 people, and while authorities have only been able to, connect him to 30 officially, they say they have no reason to doubt the other ones are probably true as well. Sam was able to continue this horrible path for so many years because of the fact that he committed these crimes in different states and different countries, which made it, of course, difficult to connect his crimes to one another. He was too fast. He changed his name a lot, and that's obviously hard. In an interview with an investigator named Sergeant LeBlanc, they discussed religious beliefs, and they spoke about the nature of sin. Here comes the devil stuff, You're like, okay, when does it get to the devil stuff? Now. During the interview, of course, Sam stated he had no fear of God and even said that God made him this way, so why should he ask for forgiveness? He said that God knew everything he did, and he also allegedly told a few select people that he believed that he himself was the devil. Number 4, Ronald DeFeo. Moving on to another case that inspired more Hollywood horror. If you've seen the Amityville Horror, in some ways this should ring some sad bells. Although the movie adds a lot of paranormal aspects that was not present in reality. Or was it? No one's really sure. That's the main argument nowadays. Ronald was charged and convicted of taking the lives of his entire family. Last year he passed away in jail at the age of 69. After his passing, certain letters that he had written were released. Before his death, Ronald had given many different accounts of what happened on that fateful night, which has made it now impossible for anyone to follow or really understand how it happened. Ronald himself stated there was no demon. You know who the demon is. It's me. I am the demon. So does this mean he wasn't in fact possessed, or he is at the time? Somebody saying they're a demon certainly doesn't help their case. I don't know. Number 3, David Berkowitz. Also known as the son of Sam, David Berkowitz is a killer who again thinks that he works for the devil. Now this time, the real culprit for the horrible crimes was a demon who had taken the shape of a dog that belonged to his neighbor. That was the said demon that made David do it. He led authorities on one of the largest manhunts ever seen after this in New York, and in true twisted killer fashion, he left notes behind. Yeah, trying to be arrogant, thinking he would never get caught. Working at 9 to 5 in the underworld, you'd think there'd be more places to duck out and hide, but David was caught and convicted. He later admitted to making up the dog story, but he did say that instead he was a member of a violent satanic cult and his crimes were committed as part of that. Number 2, Arnie Johnston. This one's a little different because this person didn't claim to be from hell, but rather they had hell inside of them when they committed their atrocious crime, and it wasn't their fault. This trial was well known previously, but it's become, of course, more widely spread as it's the trial in the newest Conjuring movie. In 1981, Arnie Cheyenne Johnston killed 40-year-old Alan Bono in what appeared to have been just a simple argument gone wrong quickly and got more twisted and confusing. When it came to his defense for the crime, the devil made him do it. Yeah, just like the third installment in the Conjuring franchise, the title, Devil Made Me Do It, is in direct relation. That was his excuse. This was the first time in history now that possession had been used in an American courtroom as defense. Prior to this, Arnie had been at the scene of about 3 exorcisms that had occurred before this, alleged possession, and this is why there's so many people that believe him. At the end of the day, the jury in the trial decided to convict him of manslaughter. And finally, number 1, Niccolo Paganini. We'll finish off this demonic list with the late Italian composer Niccolo Paganini. This man knew how to play the violin, let me tell you that. Apparently a little too well, some would say. The 18th century icon brought romance to violin technique. He studied with many violinists over his life, but what really explains his skill is the fact that his mother made a deal with the devil when the lad was only 6 years old. Niccolo leaned into these accusations and actually used it so people wouldn't mess with him anymore. They would be afraid of the violin composer, They're like, oh, we don't talk to him. He's like the Doctor Strange violin guy. He fights with music. Thinking back now, I'm like, yeah, I get that. Guy needed to invent romance via a violin. But what if he was? What if he was working for the devil the whole time? The musician passed away at age 36 and there wasn't a single church that would take him. It's pretty rude, but also it's understandable. We'll use your music at the funeral, but we're not gonna bury you. Thanks.
Starting off at number 10, we have Nick Yaris. In 1981, Nick was convicted of murder and received the death penalty. Now, Nick has a history of drugs and theft, yet he claims that he never committed murder. After being arrested for a car theft, Yaris thought that if he gave fake details about a crime he read in the paper, then he could just bargain his way out of the charges. The case in the paper was of a murder of a young woman. However, this plan went terribly wrong, as Nick was convicted of this murder. Nick spent 23 years on death row waiting for his execution. Finally, DNA evidence cleared his name and he was let out of jail. So yeah, don't lie to the police. Don't try and scam your way out of jail because it could end up much worse, like this guy. But hey, apparently Nick thanks death row for actually saving his life. Sounds weird, but he said that if he wasn't in jail, then he would have wound up dead or have been a severe drug addict like his other friends.
Coming in at number 9 is Nellie Mae Madison. In 1935, Nellie was convicted of murder and sentenced to death for shooting husband number 5, Eric Madison. To clarify, she hadn't shot 4 previous husbands, he just happened to be her 5th husband. The state Supreme Court upheld the sentence, which was the first time it was ever done for a woman. They wanted to get her good and didn't like the fact she wasn't breaking down on the stand or crying in court. She was the Iron Woman. Nellie met Eric in 1930, and after learning she had a big inheritance, he proposed to her 3 years later. A year into it, Nellie came home to find Eric in bed with a 16-year-old girl. He then beat her, telling her that he tricked her into marrying him because he wanted the money. He continued physically abusing her for 6 more days before Nellie bought a gun, intending just to scare him. On the fateful night in question, the two were arguing in the bedroom when she pulled out the gun. Eric then got a bunch of butcher knives from under the bed because they were just conveniently there and started throwing them at her. In self-defense, she shot him in the back 5 times. So a simple homicide it was not. Her sentence was then reduced to life in prison, but she was completely freed 9 years later.
Moving on to number 8, we have Richard Glossip. Richard Glossip was convicted of conspiracy to murder and then was charged with the murder of Barry Von Treese, the owner of the motel that he worked at. Now, Richard was convicted based on the word of one person, Justin Sneed, his fellow co-worker and a drug addict. Justin was a man who committed the crime and stated that Glossip made him do it. Justin received a life sentence, but Glossip was sentenced to execution by drug injection. Now, this is an example that shows how flawed this system is. Apparently, there isn't any evidence supporting that Glossip told Sneed to commit the crime, so people just believe that he made it up to get out of a harsher sentence. Now, on the day of his execution, he was actually granted a stay of the execution, and only a couple hours beforehand. This is the second time he was granted a stay. This was due to the fact that they had the wrong drug in possession. Apparently, they received potassium acetate instead of potassium chloride. So, twice, Richard avoided the death penalty. Sadly, he is now back on death row as he is still trying to clear his name.
Filling at number 7 slot is Damon A. Thibodeau, and surprisingly, I definitely heard his name before researching him, probably on TV in passing. Either way, in 1996, Damon confessed to raping and murdering his 14-year-old step-cousin and was sentenced to death, but this confession was false. Damon had been subjected to a grueling 9-hour interrogation session, and I feel like we've heard so many cases where officers literally beat beat you down, make you think of a new reality almost, or even convince you that you've done something that you haven't. At the end of it all you want to do is just tell them what they want to hear just so it ends. By 2012, he had spent 15 years on death row but was finally exonerated after DNA evidence proved that he was not the perpetrator.
In our 6th spot, we have Clyde Thompson. Now, this next criminal is named the meanest man in Texas for the crimes that he committed. Clyde Thompson has a life of crime, from being involved in robbery to being convicted of 4 murders. The first murder being when he was only 17 years old. When he was arrested for this murder, he was sentenced to death by electric chair. At that time, he was the youngest man to ever receive a death penalty. Clyde clearly had luck on his side because his death penalty was changed to life in prison. This was granted to him 2 days before his execution. Why did they change their mind? Well, David Thomas was Clyde's friend that also was convicted for helping Clyde commit his first murder. Since David didn't receive the death penalty, Clyde's sentence was changed as well. And that's how the meanest man in Texas escaped the electric chair.
Coming in at number 5 is Anthony Ray Hinton. In 1985, he was convicted of murdering 2 fast food restaurant managers in Birmingham and sentenced to death. The reason behind this conviction was the fact that ballistic evidence linked the gun used for the crime to one owned by his mother. He was found guilty despite having a solid alibi for the time of the murders, but I guess it was the 80s and people needed no reason to end a black man's life. Did you hear that? Someone just say judicial racism? I think they did. In 2014, an appeal for the case reached the US Supreme Court, who remanded the case and allowed for a retrial. With a new ballistics expert in tow, Hinton's team was able to prove that the gun owned by his mom was not the murder weapon, nor was it even connected to the murders, and he was freed after spending 30 bloody years on death row. And no, racism in this system has still not ended.
Moving on at number 4, we have Glenn Stark Chambers. In 1975, Glenn was convicted of murdering his 22-year-old girlfriend. As a result, he was on death row. They eventually changed his sentence to life in prison, but the story doesn't stop there. On February 21st in 1990, Glenn escaped the Florida Correctional Facility and hasn't been found since. He had escaped once before, but that attempt was unsuccessful and he was just caught and brought back to jail. However, this time he escaped and people believe that he's still out there. Apparently, Glenn was too smart for his own good. While making furniture, his inmates packed him in a box, which was then loaded in a truck and taken away. From there, he escaped, leaving only his clothes behind. He would be 69 years old if he was still alive, so maybe be careful and double check to make sure you really know who your neighbors are.
At number 3 is Michelle Byram. In 1999, Michelle was convicted of hiring one of her son's friends to murder her husband. Little did everyone know, the husband was extremely abusive, and the son actually confessed to Michelle that he had killed him himself. Plot twist. Hearing this, without hesitation, Michelle took the blame in order to protect his son. Claiming self-defense did nothing for her case, and she was sentenced to death. That was in 1999. In 2014, her time finally came, and mere hours before administering the lethal injection, the Mississippi Supreme Court agreed she did in fact not receive a fair trial. Her conviction was then vacated and she was released after spending 15 years on death row.
In our 2nd spot, we have Lester Eubanks. In 1965, Lester was convicted of the murder of a young girl named Mary Ellen Diener. As a result, he was sentenced to the death penalty. However, the Supreme Court changed their mind, saying the death penalty was unconstitutional. As a result, he was sentenced to life. Now, apparently, Lester was so well behaved that they allowed him to go Christmas shopping. And oh, what a mistake that was. On December 7th, 1973, that's when he went Christmas shopping, and that is also the last time he was ever seen. To this day, this criminal is still out there. They have come up with a bunch of sketchings on what Lester would look like now. It's terrifying knowing that there's a murderer still out there somewhere in this world.
And finally, at number 1 is Pablo Ibar. Now, I've never heard of Casey's Nickelodeon murders, so maybe you guys haven't either. In 1994, Butch Casey, the owner of Casey's Nickelodeon, and 2 of his employees, Sharon Anderson and Marie Rogers, were killed in a triple homicide in his own home. The whole thing was orchestrated by 2 men and was all caught on surveillance footage, which I watched, and it's not super graphic, but it is just very disturbing. After it was over, one of them actually took the t-shirt that was covering his face off, and prosecutors believed it was Pablo Ibar. Pablo was then put behind bars for 25 years, 16 of which were death row for the triple homicide. There was DNA found at the scene that did not match Pablo that defense emphasized was from the real culprit. After being convicted guilty in more than 1 trial, Pablo finally got a break in his 4th trial, where the jury came to a verdict of life imprisonment as opposed to capital punishment. I feel like you really can't execute someone because they sort of look similar to someone you saw on grainy camera footage. Like, where is the logic behind that?
Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot, we have Daniel Wozniak. In 2010, Daniel Patrick Wozniak had his wedding and honeymoon coming up that were of course going to cost a lot of money. Instead of like getting a second job or simply just doing anything else in the entire world, he decided to do the unthinkable. He ended up taking the life of his neighbor Samuel Hare and his friend Juri Kibushi so that he could steal money from them. It is absolutely insane that this is the story behind the crime, but I cannot make this stuff up. He ended up confessing his crimes to police.
You said you wanted to talk to me. What's going on?
I'm crazy and I did it.
You did what?
I killed Julie and I killed Sam.
Okay.
It is so strange how he's so matter-of-fact about that, but then suddenly it's like a switch flips and he's acting like the Joker.
Sam was
Money and insanity.
money and insanity. Okay.
That laugh is truly chilling, you guys. Daniel ended up being apprehended by US Marshals at his bachelor party 2 days before his wedding. The trial was very long, but in 2016 he was found guilty and ended up being sentenced to death. In our number 9 spot today we have the Iceman. Richard Kuklinski became one of America's most prolific serial killers after finding his career as a contract killer, which he did for about 30 years, but he also decided to carry out some killings when he wasn't being hired to do it, making him most definitely a serial killer. While he only ended up being charged and convicted for 4 killings, he had claimed that the number was actually closer to 250. He killed his victims in a multitude of ways, and he was known for being especially cruel. In a chilling confession by the killer, he explains the story behind one man's life he took, saying, quote, "It was a man and he was begging and pleading and praying, I guess, and he was please Godding all over the place. So I told him he could have half an hour to pray to God, and if God could come down and change the circumstances, he'd have that time." The story he's telling is actually about one of the crimes he kind of feels an inkling of remorse about. He continues on to say that God never showed up and finished by saying, quote, "That's one thing, I shouldn't have done that one." In our number 8 spot today we have Manuel Vela. In 2016, Manuel took the life of his girlfriend Katrina Rivera. She was initially reported missing, but after taking police on a car chase, he ended up being arrested and her body was found inside of the car. There are some exceptionally disturbing details about this case that I cannot go into, but it definitely was an incredibly terrible situation. After the chase, he was taken into police custody where he continued to display strange and scary behavior, and he also ended up confessing to the crime.
Do you think that you're possessed by the devil?
Me?
Yeah.
I'm the Antichrist.
Apparently this all happened because she had told him that she didn't want to be together anymore, which truly is so scary. It is abundantly clear that Manuel suffered from a multitude of mental health issues that clearly weren't being dealt with. Shortly after this terrible event, Manuel did end up taking his own life in his jail cell. In our number 7 spot today we have Lawrence Singleton. Behind the horrifying story of this real-life monster is one of the most incredible survival stories, and that is the one of Mary Vincent. Although Lawrence is believed to have taken the lives of more than a dozen women, Mary Vincent thankfully survived after being attacked by Lawrence. The story is incredibly gruesome. He harmed her, he threw her out of the car, and he also removed her arms with a hatchet and left her in a concrete pipe. But Mary thankfully fought with everything she had in her and got herself out of the embankment she was in, flagged down a car, and got herself to safety and to medical help. After this, she continued to be amazing and not only was able to identify her attacker, but also she testified against him. Here's where this terrifying confession comes in though. After Mary was done testifying against him in court, as she walked out of the courtroom, Lawrence whispered to her, quote, "If it's the last thing I'll do, I'll finish the job." He died. She's still alive, so guess not. In our number 6 spot today we have Ted Bundy. If you know anything about true crime, you most definitely have heard of one of the most famous killers of all time, Ted Bundy. Ted killed upwards of 30 people during his crime spree in the 1970s, and most interviews with Ted are extremely well known, but there is one interview that is very disturbing that is not quite as popular as the others. In this interview, he is talking about taking the life of the student Georgianne Hawkins. The chilling part of it is how he talks about things just so matter-of-factly, like it's a casual conversation between friends and not him describing the horrific acts he committed.
Quite lucid, talking about things. It's funny, not funny, but it's odd the kinds of things people say under those circumstances. She had a Spanish test the next day and she thought that I had taken her to help tutor me for her Spanish test.
After that clip, this interview unfortunately just gets even more disturbing as he begins whispering some more terrifying details. When I first saw this interview, I was listening through headphones, and you guys, the chill you get from having an absolute monster whispering in your ear, it's incomparable.
The Hawkins girl's head was severed and taken up the road about 25 to 50 yards and buried in a location about 10 yards west of the road on a rocky hillside.
After this horrible whispering part, he continues on with the rest of the details of that day in the same casual conversation tone that we heard before. If it wasn't obvious after listening to this specific interview, it is very clear just how disturbing Ted Bundy really was. In our number 5 spot today, we have the Vampire of Dusseldorf. Peter Kürten, who is also known as the Vampire of Dusseldorf, was actually a German serial killer from the 1930s. This man committed some incredibly atrocious acts for which he was tried and convicted. He ended up being found guilty for the killing of 9 people as well as attempting to take the lives of 7 more. This guilty verdict led to him being sentenced to beheading, which took place in 1931 when Peter was 48 years old. How he got the nickname as the Vampire of Dusseldorf was because he admitted to having drunk the blood of at least one of his victims, if not more. This is terrible to know, but it's all important as it relates to his confession, which honestly sent shivers down my spine. Apparently, right before his execution, he is said to have been thinking of the sound that the blood would make. His own. He is said to have asked, quote, "After my head is chopped off, will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my neck? I don't know." After which he added, quote, "That would be the pleasure to end all pleasures." Okay, that one speaks for itself. In our number 4 spot today, we have Dennis Rader. The BTK killer, whose real name is Dennis Rader, was one of the worst serial killers from 1974 to 1991. He left taunting letters for police and newspapers where he described his crimes, and this turned out to be his demise because after an over 10-year hiatus, his huge ego just couldn't handle, just shutting up and just being quiet, so he started to communicate with the media again in 2004. This subsequently helped the investigation and led to his arrest in 2005. At his trial, he decided to describe his crimes in detail, but also make absolutely no apology for it. Not like an apology would help, but he certainly displayed quite a level of psychopathic behavior.
And whatever money, I guess he didn't have very much money. And there I realized that, I didn't have a mask on or anything. They already could ID me, and made a decision to go ahead and put him down, I guess, or strangle him.
He ended up being sentenced to 10 consecutive life sentences with a minimum of 175 years, but no sentencing could truly ever be long enough. He remains at the El Dorado Correctional Facility, where he will most likely stay for the rest of his life. In our number 3 spot today, we have Robert Pickton. This horrible person is one of the worst Canadians to ever live and is one of our country's worst serial killers ever. Robert Pickton dropped out of school and began working at his family's pig farm, and this is where most of his absolutely horrific crimes took place. He was first arrested in 2002 and was convicted in 2007 of taking the lives of 6 people, but throughout an extremely lengthy investigation, evidence of many more killings came to light. During his time in jail, an undercover police officer posed as his cellmate, and Pickton confessed to 49 crimes to him. Yeah, he was saying to the undercover officer that he wanted to take one more life to make it an even 50, and that he only got caught because he was sloppy. The entire trial was a bit of a mess, but it led to a life sentence without the possibility of parole for 25 years, which was the longest possible sentence under Canadian law at the time. This unfortunately does mean that he will be eligible for parole within the next decade. In our number 2 spot today, we have Elizabeth Wetlaufer. This messed up confession comes from a woman who is named Elizabeth, and she was a nurse in Canada who was working at a long-term care home for elderly people. This woman, who was supposed to have dedicated her life to helping and caring for these people, instead she was doing things that had her being dubbed an angel of death. Between 2007 and 2014, she confessed to killing 8 of her patients, and she also confessed to attempting to take the lives of 4 more. On October 5th, 2016, she sat down with Detective Constable Nathan Hergott of the Woodstock Police, where she was recorded giving her 2.5-hour confession. And man, she's just sitting there talking like she's describing what she had for lunch and not what terrible things she did for years.
I took something from you that was precious and was taken too soon. I honestly believed at the time that God wanted me to do it, but I know now that's not true.
Yeah, she really just rambles on. Elizabeth is Canada's most prolific female serial killer, which is truly a title no one should aspire to hold. In our number 1 spot today, I have Kevin Davis. You guys, this is truly one of the most disturbing things I've ever heard in my entire life. Kevin Davis was 18 years old when he took the life of his own mother. It seems as though there was some sort of conversation beforehand that had made him upset, which of course is never a good enough reason to do something like this, but there are details about this crime I just wish that I could unlearn. In an interview with police, he gives them an extremely detailed account of basically everything that happened and seems to show absolutely no remorse.
I went to her room, opened a drawer at the very bottom to the right. I pulled out a hammer. I went back into the living room, and well, you kind of get the gist from there. And she was out pretty quickly. So when you drive...
I truly have no words. During his trial, a doctor did testify to say that he had a personality disorder, but that he also fully knew the difference between right and wrong, and knew that his crime was wrong, and that there was no medical diagnosis that could justify his actions. Kevin is still in jail, where he will most likely spend the rest of his life, but he will become eligible for parole in 2044.
Number 10. Maxim Petrov. Maxim Petrov was convicted for the ending of 11 people's lives in St. Petersburg between 1999 and 2000. Maxim, nicknamed Dr. Death by the Russian media, was a practicing doctor who targeted patients from a local health center, ending their lives by giving them lethal injections at their homes, then robbing them. All victims were included on the same list of lung patients who had undergone fluorography. Using this list, the police identified 72 possible future victims in an operation called Medbrat, male nurse, involving 700 police officers. They arrested Maxim when he visited one of the patients on January 17th in the year 2000. On his arrest, Maxim admitted to the deaths, but recanted his confession a few months later, blaming it on the intense psychological pressure he had endured while in custody. Various possessions stolen from the victims were later found in his flat, though he had already sold others at the market. He was suspected of ending the lives of 19 people, but tried for just 17. In 2002, Maxim was found guilty of 11 and was sentenced to life imprisonment. Number 9. Luca Magnotta. The name Luca Magnotta may sound familiar to some. Have you ever seen the Netflix documentary Don't F with Cats? Because if you have, this is where he's from. Luca took the life of Yun Lin, a university student in Montreal, Canada, in May 2012. After Luca ended his life, he then began to mail one's body parts to schools and federal political party offices. Then a video depicting the crime was posted online, and Luca fled Canada, becoming the subject of an Interpol red notice and prompting an international manhunt. In June 2012, he was arrested in an internet cafe in Berlin, where he was caught Googling himself. He also was previously sought out by animal rights groups for uploading videos of himself ending the lives of kittens. In December 2014, after 8 days of deliberations, a jury convicted him of his crime and was given a mandatory life sentence and 19 years for other charges to be served concurrently. He is currently at Port Cartier prison in Quebec. Number 8. Rosemary West. Rosemary West collaborated with her husband Fred West in the torture and the ending of lives of at least 9 women between 1973 and 1987. Rosemary also ended the life of her stepdaughter Charmaine in 1971. After police found human remains and apparent signs of torture at 25 Cromwell Street, Rose, along with Fred, were arrested in February 1994.
During her trial, Rose denied ending the lives of any of the victims. Rose told the jury that her husband committed the criminal acts alone, and she denied participating. In 1995, Rose was sentenced to life in prison while her husband ended his life before going to trial. She was found guilty of all 10 counts and was sentenced to life imprisonment, and it was emphasized that she should never be paroled. The Lord Chief Justice later decided that she should spend at least 25 years in prison, but in July 1997, Home Secretary Jack Straw subjected Rose to live out the rest of her life in jail. She's currently being held at HM Prison, Newhall in West Yorkshire. Number 7. Dennis Rader. Dennis Rader, aka BTK, an abbreviation he gave himself for bind, torture, and kill, ended the lives of 10 people between the years of 1974 and 1991 in Wichita and Park City, Kansas. He didn't just end lives, but also stalked women, and 2 women he stalked in the 1980s and one whom he stopped in the mid-1990s filed restraining orders against him. He also sent taunting letters to police and media outlets describing the details of his crimes. By 2004, the investigation of BTK was considered a cold case. Then, after a decade-long hiatus, Dennis initiated a series of 11 communications to the local media. This activity led directly to his arrest in February 2005. He pled guilty and was sentenced in 2005 to 10 life sentences, and though he's eligible for parole, it won't be until he's served at least 175 years. He is currently at El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas. Number 6. David Berkowitz. David Berkowitz, aka Son of Sam, went on a spree of ending lives with his firearm many times in New York that started in July 1976. He ended the lives of 6 people and wounded 7 others by July 1977, terrorizing New Yorkers and gaining worldwide notoriety. David eluded the biggest police manhunt in the city's history while leaving letters that mocked the police and promised future crimes, which were highly publicized by the press. David was arrested on August 10, 1977, and subsequently indicted for 8 crimes that ended lives. He confessed to all of them and initially claimed to have been obeying orders of a demon manifested in the form of a dog belonging to his neighbor, Sam. After being found mentally competent to stand trial, he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences in state prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. He then admitted that the dog and devil story was a hoax, which is shocking. Intense media coverage of the case made David a celebrity, and he seemed to enjoy it. In response, the New York State legislature enacted new statutes known popularly as Son of Sam laws, designed to keep criminals from financially profiting from the publicity created by their crimes. The statutes have remained in law in New York State despite various legal changes, and similar laws have been enacted in several other states. David is currently at Shagum Correctional Facility in New York. Number 5. Charles Cullen. Charles Cullen was a nurse who ended the lives of dozens of patients during a 16-year career spanning several New Jersey medical centers until being arrested in 2003. He confessed to committing as many as 40 deaths, at least 29 of which have been confirmed, though through interviews with the police, psychiatrists, and journalists suggest he committed many more, as some experts believe he has up to 400 victims. On March 10, 2006, Charles was brought into the courtroom of Lehigh County President Judge William H. Platt for a sentencing hearing. Charles, upset with the judge, kept repeating, "Your Honor, you need to step down," for 30 minutes until Judge Platt had Charles gagged with a cloth and duct tape. Even after being gagged, Charles continued to repeat the phrase. In the hearing, Judge Platt gave him an additional 6 life sentences. As part of his plea agreement, Charles has been working with law enforcement officials to identify additional victims. He was sentenced to 11 life sentences in 2006 and will not be eligible for parole until 2403. He is currently located at New Jersey State Prison in New Jersey. Number 4. Paul Bernardo. Paul Bernardo committed crimes together with his former wife Karla Homolka, who were nicknamed the Ken and Barbie Killers. He is known initially for taking advantage of people in Scarborough, Ontario, a suburb of Toronto, between 1987 and 1990, before ending the lives of 3 women with Karla. Among those victims was Karla's younger sister, Tammy Homolka. Karla took a plea bargain of 12 years years imprisonment, and she began giving statements to investigators. She told police that Paul had boasted that he had taken advantage of as many as 30 women, twice as many as the police suspected. This plea bargain caused a lot of outrage and was seen as controversial. Carla was released from prison in 2005 and she settled in Quebec, where she married the brother of her lawyer, where she's rumored to still be today. But now, after Paul's capture and conviction, he was sentenced to life imprisonment and was later declared a dangerous offender, thus making it unlikely that he will ever be released from prison. Following his conviction, Paul confessed to taking advantage of 10 more victims, and he is currently being held at Millhaven Institution in Ontario, Canada. Number 3. Joseph James D'Angelo. Joseph James D'Angelo, aka the Golden State Killer, was a former police officer who ended the lives of 13 people, took advantage of 50 people, and had been involved in 120 burglaries in California between 1974 and 1986. He is responsible for at least 3 separate crime sprees throughout the state, each of which spawned a different nickname in the press before it became evident that they were committed by the same person. He was also linked to hundreds of incidents of thefts, burglaries, vandalism, peeping, stalking, and prowling. He wasn't arrested until 2018 though, when DNA tracing from family members on genealogy sites linked him to his crime. In June 2020, he pleaded guilty to 13 deaths and 13 counts of taking advantage of people. In August of that same year, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He's currently serving time at Corcoran Prison in California. Number 2. Gary Ridgway. Gary Ridgway, aka the Green River Killer, was initially convicted of 48 separate deaths. As part of his plea bargain, another conviction was added, bringing the total number of convictions to 49. He ended the lives of women in the US state of Washington during the 1980s and 1990s. Now, most of Gary's victims were alleged to be sex workers and other women in vulnerable circumstances, including runaways. The press gave him his nickname after the first 5 victims were found in the Green River before his identity was known. He strangled his victims, usually by hand, and after strangling them, he would dump their bodies in forested and overgrown areas in King County, often returning to the bodies to take advantage of them. On November 30th, 2001, Gary was arrested for the deaths of 4 women whose cases were linked to him through DNA profiling evidence. As part of a plea bargain wherein he agreed to disclose the location of still missing women, he was spared the death penalty. He was sentenced to 48 life sentences with no possibility of parole, an additional life sentence, and 480 more years of tampering with evidence. He is currently at Washington State Penitentiary in Washington State. And coming in at number 1 is Robert Pickton. Robert Pickton worked full-time at his family's pig farm after inheriting it in the early 1980s. It was at this point that it was believed he started ending people's lives. He ended their lives just like they were pigs. When he was done with their bodies, he would then feed them to his pigs to get rid of the evidence, which is just messed up. He was finally arrested in 2002 and was convicted in 2007 for the deaths of 6 women and also the subject of a lengthy investigation that yielded evidence of numerous other deaths. Robert was charged with the deaths of an additional 20 women, many of them from Vancouver's downtown east side, but the charges were stayed by the Crown in 2010. Robert was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years, the longest possible sentence for second-degree murder under Canadian law at the time he was sentenced. The conviction was appealed twice by his lawyers, but ultimately rejected by Canada's Supreme Court. During the trial's first day of jury evidence, the Crown stated that Robert had confessed to 49 deaths to an undercover agent from the Office of Inspector General who was posing as a cellmate. The Crown reported that he told the officer that he wanted to end the life of another woman to make it an even 50, and that he was caught because he was sloppy. There was actually a 2-part episode inspired by Robert on the popular crime drama Criminal Minds for the season 4 finale called To Hell and Back. Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have Carl Watts. Carl Watts, also known as Coral Eugene Watts, was an American serial killer who operated in the 1970s and 1980s. Born in Killeen, Texas, Watts was a quiet and unassuming individual who led a double life as a cold-blooded killer. Watts targeted and killed numerous women, primarily in Texas and Michigan. His victims were often young women, and he would stalk them before attacking. Watts' crimes were characterized by their brutality and the lack of a discernible pattern, making it challenging for law enforcement to connect the cases. Despite his significant number of victims, Watts managed to evade capture for several years, partly due to his ability to blend into society and avoid suspicion. However, his luck ran out in 1982 when he was apprehended for burglary as well well as an attempted killing. During questioning, he ended up confessing to multiple crimes, providing details that linked him to numerous unsolved cases. Watts eventually pleaded guilty to multiple counts and received a lengthy prison sentence. His cooperation with authorities allowed them to close several cold cases and bring closure to the families of his victims. Watts died of prostate cancer while serving his sentence on September 21, 2007. Despite not achieving the same level of media coverage as some other infamous serial killers, Watts' actions left a trail of devastation and loss in the communities he targeted. In our number 9 spot today, we have Johann Unterweger. Johann was an Austrian serial killer who terrorized Vienna in the 1990s. Johann's criminal activities first gained attention in the late 1970s when he was convicted for taking the life of a young woman and sentenced to life in prison. However, during his incarceration, he managed to project a very reformed image, becoming an accomplished writer and gaining support from intellectuals who believed he had been rehabilitated. Due to his literary talent and the perception of his redemption, in a great miscarriage of justice, he was released on parole in 1990 after serving only 15 years of his life sentence. He soon became a media personality, presenting himself as a rehabilitated ex-convict and a crusader for the rights of prisoners. He even worked as a journalist and wrote articles on crime and rehabilitation, further enhancing his public image. However, beneath his charismatic persona, he harbored a dark and violent side. He began to commit heinous crimes again, committing a series of brutal killings that mirrored the style of his previous ones. Despite the gruesome nature of his crimes, Johann managed to evade suspicion for some time. He capitalized on his media connections to shape public opinion and divert attention from himself. However, his luck ran out when evidence linking him to the crimes started to mount. In 1992, he was arrested in Miami, Florida after being tracked down by Austrian and American authorities. He was extradited to Austria to stand trial for the killings of 11 women. The high-profile trial captivated the nation and received significant media coverage within Austria. The evidence against him was overwhelming, including witness testimonies, forensic evidence, and his own confessions. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. On June 29, 1994, Johann was found deceased in his prison cell, and it was later determined that he had taken his own life. In our number 8 spot today, we have Anthony Sowell. Anthony Sowell was a notorious serial killer whose crimes shocked the city of Cleveland, Ohio from 2007 to 2009. Born on August 19, 1959 in East Cleveland, Sowell's criminal activities targeted vulnerable women, specifically those struggling with addiction and those involved in sex work. Sowell's crimes took place in and around his residence on Imperial Avenue, a seemingly ordinary house that hid a horrifying secret. He would lure his victims to his home under the pretense of offering them something to feed their addictions or shelter. Once inside, his horrifying crimes would unfold. The bodies of his victims were often hidden throughout the house, concealed in various locations, including crawl spaces and buried in the backyard. While these crimes were taking place, the local community was largely unaware of the extent of the crimes occurring in their midst. The victims, many of whom were marginalized and leading transient lives, were often overlooked by society. In October 2009, a courageous survivor managed to escape from Sowell's house and alerted the authorities. When the police executed a search warrant on Sowell's property, they made the horrifying discovery of decomposing bodies, leading to his immediate arrest. The case of Anthony Sowell garnered significant attention within the Cleveland community, where the shock and horror of the crimes reverberated. Local media covered the story extensively, focusing on the heinous nature of the crimes and the impact on the victims' families. However, the case did not receive as much national or international coverage as some other high-profile serial killer cases. During Sowell's trial, the prosecution presented a compelling case against him, supported by physical evidence, DNA matches, and the testimonies of survivors. In 2011, he was found guilty on 82 counts and was sentenced to death. In our number 7 spot today, we have Maury Travis. Maury Travis was an American serial killer who terrorized the St. Louis, Missouri area in the early 2000s. His heinous crimes targeted several women, and he infamously recorded some of the crimes on videotape. In the early 2000s, Travis began a spree of violence that would claim the lives of multiple women, leaving a community on edge and law enforcement agencies frantically searching for answers. It is said that Travis would often lure the young women he targeted either to secluded areas or sometimes even to his own home. Despite the gravity of his actions, Maury Travis' case did not attract widespread media attention beyond the local region. However, the local community was acutely aware of the terror that Travis had unleashed upon their city. Law enforcement agencies diligently investigated the killings, piecing together evidence and connecting the dots to build a case against him. Ultimately, it was the discovery of Travis's collection of graphic and disturbing videos that provided critical evidence linking him to the crimes. On June 30th, 2002, faced with overwhelming evidence against him, Maury Travis took his own life in his jail cell. His death marked the end of a dark chapter in St. Louis's history, but the scars left by his actions remained. Although Maury Travis's case did not receive extensive media coverage outside of the local region, the impact of his crimes on the St. Louis community cannot be understated. In our number 6 spot today, we have Kendall Francois. Kendall Francois was an American serial killer whose horrific crimes unfolded in the quiet city of Poughkeepsie, New York during the 1990s. Born on July 26, 1971, Francois led a double life, hiding a dark and sinister secret behind his seemingly ordinary facade. Francois specifically targeted women, and he would lure them to his home where he subjected them to unspeakable acts of violence and ultimately took their lives. Shockingly, he managed to conceal his crimes by hiding the bodies of his victims within his residence, creating a haunting and gruesome secret that remained undiscovered for an extended period. Despite the disturbing nature of his crimes, Kendall Francois' case did not receive significant media attention at the time. The lack of widespread coverage was due in part to the marginalized nature of his victims. This made it easier for their disappearances to go unnoticed by the broader public. The true extent of his crimes only came to light in 1998 when a routine visit from police officers, prompted by a complaint about a foul odor, led to the shocking discovery of multiple decomposing bodies hidden throughout his home. In total, the remains of 8 women were found, exposing the gruesome reality of his actions. Kendall Francois was subsequently arrested, and during his trial, the disturbing details of his crimes were revealed. In 2000, he was found guilty on multiple counts and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. While Kendall Francois' case did not receive the same level of national or international media attention as some other high-profile serial killer cases, it serves as a chilling reminder of the hidden dangers that can lurk within seemingly ordinary communities. In our number 5 spot today, we have Belle Gunness. Belle Gunness was a Norwegian-American serial killer who is believed to have killed over 40 people, including her own family, in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Belle was born in Norway in 1859 and immigrated to the United States in 1881. She settled in Chicago, where she married her first husband and started a family. This was all fine and well until things soon took a turn. Belle began to collect life insurance policies on her family members, and if you're a true crime fan, you likely know where this is going. She then went on to eventually kill them in a fire. She then moved to LaPorte, Indiana, where she purchased a farm and continued to lure wealthy suitors to her property just to then kill them for their money and assets. She was known for her physical strength and was able to bury her victims' bodies on her property. Belle's crimes were discovered in 1908 when a fire destroyed her farm and the remains of several of her victims were found. We love when the villain is brought to justice, but unfortunately that did not happen here. Belle herself was never found, and it is believed that she may have faked her own death and fled the country. In our number 4 spot today, we have Charles Schmid. Charles Schmid, infamously known as the Pied Piper of Tucson, was a figure of terror during the 1960s for his involvement in a string of brutal crimes that shook the city of Tucson, Arizona. Operating between 1964 and 1965, Schmid's first victim, Aline Rowe, disappeared in the fall of 1964. Her disappearance sparked concern among her family and friends, but initially received limited attention from the media. As time went on, his violent tendencies escalated and his list of victims grew. The case gained some attention locally due to the disappearances and the growing sense of unease in Tucson. People were disturbed by the disappearances and the realization that a predator was lurking in their midst. It wasn't until one of Schmid's acquaintances came forward with crucial information that law enforcement finally uncovered the extent of his crimes. In 1965, he was arrested and charged with the killings of Aline Rowe, Gretchen Fritz, and Wendy Fritz. The revelation of his dark secrets shocked the community and brought the nation's attention to the grisly acts committed by the Pied Piper of Tucson. During his trial, the disturbing details of his crimes were exposed, with witnesses testifying to his manipulation, his disregard for human life, and the chilling pleasure he derived from his actions. The case captivated the local media, but it did not achieve the same level of national media coverage as some of the era's more high-profile cases, such as the Manson family. Charles Schmid was found guilty of the killings and sentenced to death. However, in 1972, his sentence Prince was commuted to life imprisonment when the death penalty was briefly abolished in the United States. Schmid spent the rest of his life behind bars, becoming a haunting reminder of the evil that can exist within seemingly ordinary individuals. In our number 3 spot today, we have Charles Albright. Charles Albright, famously known as the Eyeball Killer, was a convicted serial killer whose heinous crimes unfolded in Dallas, Texas during the 1990s. Born on August 10, 1933, Albright appeared to lead a relatively normal life. He grew up in a middle-class family, received a good education, and pursued a career in the field of ophthalmology. His chosen profession, specializing in eye care, added a very eerie twist to his later crimes. The hallmark of his crimes was the removal of his victims' eyes, leading to his chilling moniker, the Eyeball Killer. This disturbing signature left a lasting impression on the local community, instilling fear and disbelief in the hearts of those who heard of his deeds. However, this case did not capture the same level of national or even international attention as some other notorious killers of the time. In 1991, Albright's reign of terror came to an end when he was arrested and charged with taking the lives of 3 women, Mary Lou Pratt, Susan Peterson, and Shirley Williams. Albright was convicted of his crimes and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, and he remained incarcerated until his death in 2020. In our number 2 spot today, we have Gary Ray Bowles. Gary Ray Bowles, widely known as the I-95 Killer, was an American serial killer who terrorized the southeastern United States during the early 1990s. His specific targeting of gay men along the Interstate 95 corridor left a trail of fear and devastation in his wake. Despite the gravity of his crimes, Bowles' case did not garner the same level of attention as some other notorious killers of the era. He began his killing spree in March of 1994, spanning over an intense 8-month period. His MO involved targeting vulnerable gay men, often befriending them and gaining their trust before subjecting them to his crimes. This spree would go on to leave a trail of tragedy and heartbreak in multiple states along the I-95 corridor. Bowles' criminal activities finally came to an end in November of 1994 when he was apprehended in Florida. He was subsequently charged with multiple killings, and his capture provided a sense of relief and closure to the affected communities. However, the media attention surrounding his arrest and subsequent trial remained relatively contained. During his trial, the disturbing details of his crimes were revealed, shedding light on the extent of his violence and the tragic loss of innocent lives. Gary Ray Bowles was convicted for 6 killings and received multiple death sentences. He spent years on death row, and his case brought attention to the flaws and complexities of the criminal justice system. In 2019, he died of natural causes while awaiting execution, closing a very dark chapter in the history of serial killers in America. And finally, in our number 1 spot today, we have Cleophas Prince Jr. Cleophas Prince Jr., commonly known as the Claremont Killer, was an American serial killer who operated in the Claremont neighborhood of San Diego, California during the 1990s. Between January and September 1990, Prince embarked on a violent spree targeting and taking the lives of women in the area. Prince would break into their homes or lure them to secluded areas, and while the case did receive attention from local media outlets, the national and international coverage remained relatively limited. Several factors could explain the lack of widespread attention. During the same period, other high-profile serial killer cases, such as those of Jeffrey Dahmer and Ted Bundy, dominated the media landscape, diverting attention away from the Cleophas Prince Jr.'s crimes. Additionally, the demographic profile of Prince's victims may have played a role in the limited coverage. It wasn't until September 1990, after an exhaustive investigation and the implementation of advanced forensic techniques, that Cleophas was finally identified as the Claremont Killer. He was arrested and subsequently convicted, ultimately receiving multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole.